Hello, this is Digital Accessibility, the people behind the progress. I'm Joe Walensky, the creator and host of this series. And as an accessibility professional myself, I find it very interesting as to how others have found their way into this profession. So let's meet one of those people right now and hear about their journey. Well, hello. Let's get started with this interview. And for this one, I am pleased to be joined by Matthew Lucan. Hello, Matthew. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, everything's going pretty well. And it's a nice summer day in the area where I am, which is home office in Vashon Island, Washington, near the Blink Seattle headquarters. Where are you talking to us from?
Today from Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me a little bit. And, this series is all about meeting people that are doing a lot of work to move accessibility forward in their work and in the communities. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. But before we get started, why don't you just talk a little bit about what you're up to today?
So today we are up to a whole bunch of different aspects of maturity model where we are growing the team and hiring. So there's a lot of educating our new team members, making sure they understand the process, that we're doing it consistently, but also trying to figure out and educating people across different spectrums, whether it be students in college settings or whether it's within the place that I currently work. Trying to get people to understand the intersectionality between what we need to do, what we should be doing, how we can bring it to life, but most importantly, how it is an iterative process. You can't get from 0 to 100% in a moment, but rather, what is the best way to get there as quickly as you can? And some days we spend time holding people's hands because they feel like something is going to go into production that's not as good as it should be. That's okay, right? That's what backlogs are for. But also maybe, trying to get people to understand, how do you strategically engage a product owner in conversation to take 3 steps instead of trying to do it in 6 steps, or trying to take too much and try to do it in 2 steps. So a lot of our day, every day, is educating, mentoring, helping people understand, and most importantly, coaching.
I appreciate you using that iteration term. I use that a lot myself. As new people come into the accessibility area, a lot of times they get overwhelmed because there is a lot of information. If you just Google that and then or suddenly looked at the WCAG and it's like, wow, where do I even start? And I like to tell people that you just start wherever you can start and build on that, and you've already made progress just by whatever your starting point is.
Exactly. And I teach college too, and one of the things that I tell people is that like, whether it's user experience or accessibility specifically or both, is that everyone is used to this methodology growing up, that you take the reverse pyramid approach, right? We teach you a simple thing like maybe addition, then you learn subtraction, then multiplication and division, right? You build upon it and you need the skills from the previous thing. So we get so conditioned to learning that way. And then when you come into accessibility, it's like, okay, we're building a pyramid, but we're not going to have a strong foundation because there's too much going on. So you have to understand contextually that we're going to add pieces here and then pieces there and a little piece here. And maybe it's in the middle of the pyramid, maybe it's near the top, and then eventually it fills in. And so now our understanding over time takes the shape of that pyramid, right? And because it's so spotty, it becomes very, very difficult. And when we think about user experience in general and trying to understand that, there's no path, right? There's so many different ways to get into UX. You can have different types of backgrounds and education and change professions, but all of it stems from passion and empathy and understanding the user's experience, whether they are able-bodied, disabled, whether they're blind, whether they're sighted. It doesn't matter. It's about understanding how to build that experience. And now when we start thinking about those different pieces and how they fill in that shape, it now makes it easier to understand that I am feeling overwhelmed, and it makes sense why I'm feeling overwhelmed because it's little bits and pieces, and it eventually starts to come out of the mist, and we start to see it, and we start to understand it. But then we have to apply the empathy because the people we're working with are going through the exact same problem. They have little pieces of information, and now we have to help get their vision clearer so they can see the same thing we're seeing. So it's hugely important for people to understand that it takes a while, right? It's a journey. It's not a one and done type of thing.
And the journey is the theme of this series is finding out those starting points and the building blocks that get us to where we're at. So maybe why don't we move back, back in time to wherever you think is a good spot, and maybe talk about some highlights from your career that maybe started to move you into the things that you do today.
Sure. So all my background in education post high school was around aviation. And so as I, learned computer science in general with aviation applications and then worked into my career, it was always aviation based and worked for the FAA and then worked for Northwest Airlines, which was then acquired by Delta Airlines. All of that was my background. But because I was always inquisitive and always challenging and trying to tinker with things like how can we optimize something? And at the time, of course, this was called, um, system engineering and performance enhancement and many, many other names. It eventually became to be understood as user experience. So as we started looking at as a company in the age of the personal computer and the internet, we started looking at, well, how can we take these really manual processes and how can we apply digital to them and make them simpler? But then what we started to see was people were getting confused by the way we designed it. So how can we make it simpler for people with English as a second language, for example, because the airline operated around the world? So how do we start thinking about the user there and the simplification of adding automation to be able to skip steps and pull data where possible and pre-fill in fields, and then on and on and on. And then eventually moving beyond the airlines just into pure digital. And so I started becoming a user experience designer, started teaching college, doing it at the same time, so a second gig. Of course, glutton for punishment, started a third gig to start my own web firm. And we did that for a very specific reason, which was what we found in college was that in digital and web development and web design, that students get a degree in it. But what you need to get in the door is millions of other things that are not taught to you in school. So how do we help get students really ready and make their education valuable? They have to go way above and beyond the textbook and way beyond just what we're teaching them from a degree curriculum. So we set up a web firm that basically is an apprenticeship. Come work with us. We'll take a model where we'll sell a cheaper price point to smaller businesses that want websites with the understanding that we're educating students. So it takes a little bit longer, right? But we'll guarantee its quality and they benefit because they're helping people learn and we're helping them learn and they can use it in their portfolio. And over our career, we had over 65 different people in the Minneapolis area take us up on that and learn how to run this. And then as I continue on in my career, ended up working for over 275 different brands, trying to come in and optimize their teams or bring them to a different place of operating from a user experience perspective or a digital team or shop perspective. And eventually, all of a sudden, there was an opportunity where it was thrust upon me to run an dedicated accessibility team. So quickly morphing to, okay, what do I need to know that's slightly different about just pure accessibility than user experience? And how do we educate designers, right, to be inclusive designers and not wait till you get a defect in development? Like, what can we do to influence the design so that it is more accessible going into development, which will lessen the burden on the developer, but also lessen the defects going into production? And that's what we're currently doing.
And just going back to your experience in the aeronautical industry, did had that been where you had accessibility exposure at that time? Because I'm kind of interested
Actually, I
in
did.
how that worked in that industry. It's one that I'm not
Yeah.
familiar with that well.
Yeah, so Northwest Airlines was one of the first airlines to actually have a self-service kiosk concept. And I was actually on that project. And so as you think about, not only you have the digital interface, but you also have the physical piece to it. So what we see with kiosks is, we start thinking about kiosks were starting to come about for self-service at the same time that the internet and web is starting to become proficient. People start having their own personal computers. So we start seeing this concept that people can do things for themselves, like ordering products and interacting in a digital way. So there was a fear of introducing this kiosk. Would people actually use it? Right? They're so used to going to an agent. Would they actually go and want to be self-service and go touch this device to do this and check in and potentially do their bags or change the sheets or whatever? How much can we introduce to it and how do we do that? And then we start thinking about like software development design and service design and MVP products. Like, if we introduce just the check-in, is it robust enough that they'd use it? Or do we need to do other things in it? And how much is too much, right? If we invested too much effort into putting all these bells and whistles into it, right? Where's that sweet balance? So what we launched was the ability to check in, the ability to change your seat, your ability to maybe request a wheelchair and launch with that. And then now what we see is so much more, right? 20 years later, we're seeing customers can now check in, print a boarding pass, print a bag tag, attach it to their own bag, and drop it on the conveyor belt. No one would believe the consumer would actually want to do this and prefer to do it than having someone else do it for them. So all of this, starts thinking about accessibility and thinking about how do we have cognitive load and how do we deal with English as a second language and what can we communicate through icons and imagery versus actual text and words so it's not too heavy. So we started having to think about all of those things as digital started to grow. And then we just see that naturally transition into what we know today.
Well, I know over a lot of things in the airline industry, there's things that are regulated, things have to be done in a certain way. Is the work that you were doing with accessibility with Northwest at the time, was that kind of homegrown things you were doing for, specifically for your customers, or did you have peers and colleagues in that industry that were sharing ideas about how to move forward?
Both, really both, right? Delta Airlines and Northwest Airlines at the time were very employee centric, right? So we worked with employees that had different abilities and disabilities as part of our mechanism. And mostly because it was a cost effective way to do so, right? Rather than trying to bring in external customers, pay them for their time, we had employees that were already paying who wanted to help, right? So we were starting to leverage that passion and compassion that we had generated within our own company to help us move the needle and move it to the direction that we needed to.
And for the things that you're involved in now, are there any new passion projects that you're able to talk about, or are things that you're hoping to see happen in your area and moving in the future?
So my current passion project is, from a college perspective, I am still teaching college, so like 15 years at this point, and it's really around, how how can you learn about user experience or accessibility and get into the work environment in a way that is not breaking the bank, right? That something that industry will accept, right? So the concept of certificates and boot camps and all these other things are in the marketplace, right? And they probably will continue to be in the marketplace. There is no true degree, undergraduate degree in user experience. There are graduate degrees, but really it's masking the name. They're really like human factors degrees or psychology degrees that have a label of user experience behind them. So trying to figure out the best way to do that and how do we get people into industry. There's a huge shortage in many fields, you know, nursing, medical, pilots. User experience is just one more of them. As we think about how we need to shift and morph and fix all of these digital products that we have made in the past into something that is keeping current with technology, with different abilities, we need more and more people. So, how can we bring people from other disciplines or other backgrounds and get them into the digital space? And can they do it in such a way that it's cost effective, it's quick, it's timely? Industry will bring them on board, but also embedded in accessibility. How can they do it well, inclusively, and not have to go and invest company money to go fix it later when we realize it's not right? So I'm very passionate about how can we educate the next community because it's very community based in what we do.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure how things are, organized, where you're working now, but in different organizations, it's some larger organizations have a broader accessibility support group that helps establish it in different departments and divisions, and then a lot of other organizations it's just because a particular department or division has an evangelist who makes it happen for what they're doing. I was just wondering, kind of in your experience, what experiences you've had in that, and what you think is kind of the best way for organizations to move forward.
Well, I've seen lots of iterations and lots of different models. Um, but what I try to stress to people is that they need to really, really understand that where things start and where they move to and end up is something that will happen, right? If they think that, putting accessibility in one particular department or team and that it's going to remain there forever, that doesn't make sense, right? User experience and accessibility go hand in hand. So in some cases, it makes sense to put it within design. And there's also the facet of the build, right? So do you put it in development, right? Do you move it in IT? Do you have a company that has consumer facing products as well as employees, right? Do you put it in DEI or do you put it in the HR department? The answer is always going to be it's going to depend and it's always going to change. And this is what leaders need to understand is it will change. So don't get hung up on where you start or where it goes, but rather understanding that it needs to organically go where it needs to go, which is not something US based companies are very adept at, right? They don't understand true homogeneous or uh, organizationally agnostic working teams. They think about everything as funding and where something sits within a chart. And accessibility is not something that sits in a chart. Everybody does it. Everybody needs to do it. Everybody has to do it all the time. So with that, it's a true enterprise solution. So where do you put that?
Well,
There's nowhere to, right? Because there's no true enterprise organizations across that type of structure. So it has to be something different and thought about as different.
I appreciate your sentiments in that area. I mean, in my own work, one of the things that's a philosophy item for me is to not be the gatekeeper, not be the. I'm there as a mentor, as a resource, as an evangelist to move things forward. Hopefully, as a leader, as you were talking about. But whenever things start to suddenly the projects start to be only funneled through me, that's where I always want to have a conversation and identify
Mhm.
where everybody can bring it into their own practice.
Yeah, just like the organizational problem, right? There's also the carrot and stick philosophy. Some companies, right, they have audit and compliance and risk and legal and things like that, the stick team. And then they have the carrot team, the team that is trying to cajole people to do things, right? So HR and managers of people and things like that. Accessibility is both those things. You have to be the carrot and the stick at the same time. So a little bit of Schrodinger's box. It's like it's all and it's nothing. So how do you think about that? And it's very difficult to explain to leaders. Like my job morphs every moment of every day, and often within the same conversation, because sometimes I have to be the hard nose to say no. At the same time, I have to cajole them to do the right thing. I have to be a passion driver and convince people to be passionate about something that they don't want to. And then I've got to tame the expectations of the people that want to be overly passionate. It's like, okay, how do we bring this in the middle? So yeah, it's very, very interesting profession to be in.
Well, I appreciate you taking a few minutes to chat with us about your experiences and your ideas about things. And hopefully, we'll be able to meet up when things start to come out of the pandemic at a conference or something like that.
My pleasure.
Thanks a lot, Matthew. Bye bye.